violence, poverty, inequality, the climate movement, and its difficulties to achieve its goals. The idea of the self and its exploration back in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the concept of the self in today's political struggles. What is democracy today, and why is the French Revolution such a pivotal point in history? How did religious movements evolve into social movements? And why are we witnessing strong polarization in the world of politics nowadays? Our guest, Professor Bourke, Professor of the History of Political Thought at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of King's College of Cambridge, helps us understand these and other inquiries while he brilliantly exposes parallels and differences of today's social movements and events back in history. In addition, he introduces us to Edmund Burke and his thoughts on the French Revolution, Kant's revolutionizing ideas, and Hegel's vision of history and its relevance to the times we live in today. Oh, Ceci? It's about time. The music just started. What do I do? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? I am here. Ceci? Is anyone there?
Oh, Paul, I'm here. Thank you. That was fantastic. Hi, my name is Ceci. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see. In this season, we're talking about movement. And today we'll talk about social movements from a social as well as a historic perspective, exposing parallels and differences of today's social movements and events back in history. For this closing episode, I'm honored to be accompanied by Professor Swen Hutter, Lichtenberg Professor for Sociology at the Freie Universität and the WZB Social Science Center in Berlin. Hello, Swen. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very eager to talk with our guest today to discuss past and present social movements. But I guess our listeners want to know who our guest is today.
Our guest today is Richard Bourke, Professor of the History of Political Thought at the University of Cambridge, co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Political Thought and a Fellow of King's College of Cambridge. Professor Bourke studied at the University College Dublin and completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge. He earned a second BA in Classics at Birkbeck College, University of London. In 2022, he was awarded an honorary degree of Doctor of Arts by University College Dublin. A Fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Historical Society as well, his work focuses on the history of political thought, particularly on the political ideas of the Enlightenment and its aftermath, and includes ancient philosophy and political theory in the 19th and 20th centuries. Honoured with awards such as the Istvan Hont Memorial Book Prize in Intellectual History, his publications range from nationalism and conservatism to political judgment and popular sovereignty, including Irish modern history, the philosophy of history since Kant, and the history of democracy. These publications comprise numerous articles and books such as Peace in Ireland, The War of Ideas, The Princeton History of Modern Ireland, Empire and Revolution, The Political Thought of Edmund Burke, and his most recent work, Hegel's World Revolutions. His research has been funded by the Humboldt Stiftung and the DAAD, and besides the previously mentioned, he holds a number of other fellowships in Europe and the United States. As editor, Professor Bourke also serves as series co-editor of Cambridge University Press Ideas in Context and is member of various prestigious editorial boards, such as the European Advisory Board of Princeton University Press and the editorial board of the Journal of British Studies, as well as of the History of European Ideas and of the Modern Intellectual History.
It is an honor, Professor, to have you here in this closing episode.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be speaking with you.
Well, we will certainly talk about social movements today. But before that, let's talk about democracy. There is a common belief to see Athens as the place of birth of democracy. When Athens came to flourish, democracy was not seen as the best of the ideas. At least Spartans and Thebans saw democracy as a rather radical system. And the two elements commonly argued to explain why democracy was different then from what it is now are mainly that voting was not available for everyone. So we know that, for example, women or slaves could not vote. And then a second argument is that not every individual was conceived to be equal, since this principle that every individual has equal value was established much later by Christian philosophy. So besides these two elements, Professor Bourke, in its core, how was democracy different then to what we understand as democracy today?
Yes, that's a very large 2005, a large question involving 2,500 years of European and world history. Democracy, as you say, is a very old word. It stems, as you also said, from the Greeks, specifically from the Athenians. We say the Greeks, but of course the Athenians were neither Thebans nor Spartans, as you say, and whilst the Spartans did have a mixed constitution, they were deeply skeptical about democracy. The Athenians had some sort of mixed system of government, which involved the participation of large sections of the population, the male citizens, so not slaves, not metics either, and not women. I do think it's important to differentiate that ancient system of political organization from the modern thing that we call democracy. I think I'd rather say that democracy was reinvented rather than rediscovered. So with the search for accountable government around the time of the American and French revolutions, the term or the word democracy resurfaced and it gained some new currency. But it wasn't still the dominant term used in the revolutions. The word republic was rather than democracy. Both 1776 and 1789 were about achieving an accountable parliamentary system. Now, the word democracy did have some circulation then, but as I say, it's not the dominant usage to sort of pick out what's going on in France, or for that matter, America. The word democracy achieved more prominence, I would say, in the 1830s. And then, of course, it became pervasive in the 1840s. I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville had a large influence in its dissemination. But its use then was deployed largely in the context of struggle and disagreement. That situation changed again in the 1880s, I would say, when mass political parties emerged and mass electorates came on the scene, marking the beginning of democracy as we know it. So there are several different periods there. There's the ancient period, there's the early modern period, if you like, culminating in the French Revolution, which most historians see as the sort of as the birth moment of modern democracy. I myself think that's a simplification, simply because it's a revolutionary era and no one had settled on the final reference for the term. I think what we think of as democracy is something that as I say, emerges in the 1880s, a mass voting population, excluding, of course, women until the early 20th century, but nonetheless, a vast male voting population down until around about 1917, say. But also mass political parties. So you're dealing with a new world in which parliamentarism is itself transformed. So that's the major transformation I would draw attention to, and they're the differences I would highlight. Direct democracy of the Athenian kind, a representative regime of the French revolutionary kind, and a mass democracy after, for instance, the full enfranchisement of the male voter in England in the 1880s.
The American and the French revolutions shaped the future course of European history, forcing European monarchs to make concessions that gave birth to parliamentary forms of government. But how did this happen? In his book, The Middle Ages in Japan, From Feudalism to Democracy, Japanese philosopher Tsuneaki Kakisu makes an interesting point. He argues that equality was born in medieval society through the invention of bilateral agreements by people such as feudal lords, samurais, and peasants who entered these bilateral agreements as a condition for survival. He interestingly notes that countries of the world can be divided into the ones that went to medieval periods, such as Japan, Western European countries, and countries of the immigrants from Western Europe, such as America, Canada, Australia, and so on, which are democratic nations today, and on the other hand, many countries of the Eurasian continent, which are not democratic nations, which still have kings, dictators, totalitarian parties, military commanders, or religious leaders that hold totalitarian power. Professor Bourke, do you agree with Kakisu that the idea of equality is the great legacy of medieval society, and that therefore countries that did not experience a medieval period, it is for them very difficult, when not impossible, to become democratic states?
Well, I would say yes and no, or rather I might say no and yes. So the society of the Middle Ages in Europe, and the idea in your commentator's work is to juxtapose Europe with other parts of the world. The society of the Middle Ages in Europe was a highly stratified one, divided into ranks and orders. So equality simply did not obtain. So to that extent, I'd have to say no, medieval Europe was not an egalitarian society, and therefore the idea that egalitarianism emerged there and that therefore accounts for a sort of parting of the ways between post-feudal societies in Europe and others in the world doesn't quite work. But in a certain way, on the other hand, maybe yes, because within medieval society in Europe, there did exist, as you just have mentioned, Christianity, and Christianity did in some way introduce the idea of the equality of humanity before God. And so whilst medieval Europe was an inegalitarian social structure, it did have egalitarian principles operating within it, within aspects of its religious worldview. Even though that worldview itself was hierarchically structured, that's to say, there was a clerisy and a lay population. So already Christianity itself was a hierarchical structure. But nonetheless, the notion that we are all equal in the eyes of our maker became socially and morally highly influential over time, even beyond Christianity itself. And so to that extent, I think there is something in the statement that the specific character of society in the medieval era prepared the groundwork for modern egalitarian ideas, which may account for some of the differences between, say, early modern China, early modern Japan, and 18th century America and England, if you wanted to have some contrasts. So I think the picture is a bit more complicated, and it depends on what you mean by through medieval society. I mean, we're tracking a development over a 500-year period here, so a lot is going on. Of course, Wade Tocqueville himself, in his Democracy in America, had introductory material in his book, which also took this long view, charting this gradual, slow, steady rise of egalitarianism out of a rank-ordered society. So he's the first person to have proposed this sort of broad historical sociological framing. And I think if one views it with the necessary qualifications and complications, it has some validity, yes, but it's a complicated picture.
Professor, I myself have some doubts on Kakisu's theory. I thought about the hacienda system in Mexico versus the European feudalism, in this case the Andalusian encomiendas, where the results were of course different, because although the hacienda system seemed really similar to these European models of feudalism in terms of concentration of effective power, I mean, there were some differences regarding mobility and so on, but well, as the crown moved to eliminate the encomiendas labor, the Spaniards consolidated private landholdings and recruited labor on a permanent or casual basis. And in the case of haciendas, even if the hacienda became secure private property and survived the colonial period and into the 20th century, eventually, even after revolution, when the land was redistributed, inequality would still stand in the way for the development of democracy.
Sure. Well, actually, in Marxist historiography, there's a long established question about, for instance, the Asiatic mode of production and to what extent that's different from the social development of most European societies. And of course, equally, one might juxtapose, as you've just done, the hacienda and European feudalism. I, of course, completely take your point that some hierarchical structures are more rigid than others, and less rigid hierarchical structures incorporate movement within themselves, or what we might say, what we might describe as having principles of accommodation within them. And that's certainly proved to be the case with feudalism over time, that a stark antithesis between lord and vassal managed to mollify over time. And that's partly because, as you're implying, it was never that stark to begin with. That's to say, there were reciprocal ties between vassal and lord, relations of mutual accommodation and dependence. And because of that, there was the means of, as it were, rapprochement over time. And therefore, you didn't get this sort of starkly antithetical system. I mean, South Asia had a more starkly antithetical system. Some people described, social relations in the Mughal empire as also feudal. I mean, there was certainly something like sub-infeudation, lords and dependents, which had itself been a product of conquest. Of course, feudalism was itself a product of the conquest of the Roman Empire by invading barbarian hordes. Well, so also South Asian empires of the Mughal sort was a product of successive stages of Islamic conquest, in which the local, as it were, native religion was conquered and subordinated, and that subordination remained stark down until the arrival of European powers in the 17th and 18th century. So broadly speaking, I'd accept your point about differences within feudalism, which enabled it to, as it were, self-correct and mollify itself. Sure.
Maybe coming back to Europe, to the kind of period of course, the American War of Independence and also the French Revolution. And in that context, of course, you have written extensively on Edmund Burke, an Anglo-Irish statesman, economist and philosopher, witnessing all these events as they unfolded. And contrary to other observers of the French Revolution, Edmund Burke already back at that time described it as a democratic revolution. So my question, maybe to take one step back, would first be, because I'm very curious to know why you so extensively studied the life of Edmund Burke and his thinking. And then, of course, as a follow-up question, why did he already in that moment of time think as this democratic moment?
Sure. Well, very quickly on the first part of your question as to how I sustained, you might say, how I sustained an interest for a long time in Edmund Burke. And I think my answer would be partly it's built within your question. That's to say, he engaged so directly with the events of his era, which included the American and French revolutions, but also the expansion of the British Empire in South Asia, and also the transformation of British domestic politics. That just made him an exceptionally interesting figure to examine, since he was a complex political thinker himself. So to track how he responded to this changing landscape was pretty absorbing. In addition, of course, he engaged very much with the thinkers of his era, Montesquieu, David Hume, whom he knew, Adam Smith, whom he knew, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is amongst the first English commentators to review. So it meant that he had an interesting intellectual landscape with which one had to engage, as well as a political one. In relation to the second part of your question, which comes on to really a major preoccupation of his at the end of his career, or the last 7 years of his career, that's to say, the French Revolution itself. I mean, he began responding to the revolution as early as the summer of 1789, so it fascinated him. And of course, he became probably one of its first, and certainly its first, coherent and complex critics. I would say he's unusual in describing the revolution as democratic. As I say, that wasn't the standard term at the time. It was much more, in terms of revolution, was much more standardly described as trying to achieve parliamentary monarchy. After all, the monarchy is not abolished for some time. Parliamentary monarchy, or maybe constitutional republicanism, or something like that. But others did use the word democracy. Thomas Paine did, for instance. Now, Burke, however, wanted to describe the French Revolution as democratic for polemical purposes. Basically, first of all, he thought that the idea of natural rights entailed a challenge to differential property distribution. So he thought it was democratic in the sense that it had a democratic view of property. In other words, it was against a social division of labor, against a socially stratified society altogether. In other words, we would say he saw it as prospectively socialist, but that's not the phraseology that was used at the time. But in a way, that's one of the things that he wanted to capture with the word democracy. And second, because he thought that politically the French Revolution challenged the very idea of a political division of labor based on qualification to rule. So before, really, in European thought, different political thinkers had a view that, there would be some qualification to rule. In other words, some people might rule better than others. I mean, everyone is not going to rule equally. And they had criteria of selection. But that was exploded, Burke thought, with the revolution. And so everyone might equally rule. And he thought actually that was harping back to the Athenian lot system, the drawing of straws for the selection for office. And he thought, okay, that has a certain functionality in Athens, but in a modern territorial state with mass populations, France had a population of 30 million, this would evidently be chaos. And so he wanted really to blacken the events with the term democracy, because democracy, broadly speaking, had a negative connotation. What we forget is, even for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Athenian constitution had been a failure. I mean, Rousseau admired the Spartans, he admired the Romans. He thought it was self-evident, and he wasn't unusual on this. This is the standard view. He thought it was self-evident that Athens was a sort of failed constitution, because although I mentioned earlier it sort of had a separation of powers, that's to say, it had different institutions. It had an ecclesia, an assembly. It also had a council, and it also had law courts, and these were separate divisions, but they weren't constructed on distinct principles. So they tended to be blurred into one and to be one sort of popular regime. It was a sort of failed populism, if one wants to use terminology that Rousseau didn't use to try and sort of capture his point. That's to say that there was no institution set properly against another institution, but just different institutions which kind of did the same thing in an incoherent way. So anyway, Bourke used the term democracy in relation to France really as a sort of critical instrument to condemn the revolution. That's how I'd put it.
Of course, we all know that the French Revolution then gave way to another set of republican revolutions around 1848-49. And in the fall of 1849, of course, contemporaries considered these revolutions largely as a failure. And for more than a century, many historians agreed. I mean, today, of course, we look at these kind of revolutions a bit differently when we look at the long-term effects and the immediate successes and see them in a much more positive light. As in many European countries, the liberation of the peasantry and agrarian reforms were completed. The principle of the rule of law was established, basic individual rights were largely secured, and the parliamentarization of the political order was initiated. I mean, although one, of course, needs to add that particularly in that area, many resistances and counterweights remained there for a long time, I'm still wondering what's your take on this kind of moment of 1848-49 and these revolutions? What role did they really play for the success of modern democracy?
Yes, very good question. I mean, I think one would have to separate the revolutionary dynamic from the values which it was intended would be embodied within the revolutionary dynamic. So, obviously, 1848-49 is an era, a year, if you like, of successive revolutions, more or less across a continent. And revolution has not become the standard mechanism of social change, and certainly not of a political administration since. Obviously, there have been other revolutions, the Russian, the Mexican, the Chinese, so on and so forth, and these have been enormously consequential. But it's not the standard means of achieving social and political change, and it's certainly not a standard means of political administration. Nonetheless, many of the values associated with the period 48-49 obviously did end up having traction. So although the revolutions might have been described as a contemporary failure, there are arguments for saying there was long-term success in terms of the gradual spread of accountable government, the gradual spread of a preoccupation with social justice, and of course the gradual spread of nationalism. I mean, the infection of nationalism, as it was described at the time, spread really after the late 1840s, when the idea that, well, if you're going to govern yourself, surely you should be able to decide which state it is that you're in that is self-governing. So that was a whole new additional transformation that took place. So I think it is a pivotal moment which was transformative, only locally a failure and not a long-term failure, although I think it partly taught that revolution itself is a sort of problematic instrument of social change.
about revolutions, Professor. In your latest book, Hegel's World Revolutions, you explain how, according to Hegel, a series of revolutions gave way to the rise of civil society and the modern state as we know it today, which is a state based on social contract and the rule of law. So according to Hegel, how shall we understand history, and to what extent would Hegel's vision be relevant regarding our contemporary society?
Well, okay, thanks very much. There's a lot there. First of all, you're asking me about Hegel's his own view of history, but in addition, you're asking me about the relevance of his view of his society for that's to say, for contemporary society. So I'll tackle both those questions in turn. First of all, as regards Hegel's view of history itself, well, there's an enormous amount of misunderstanding about this topic. I would say quite simply that history for Hegel is just what happens. That's to say, it's the contingently interconnected chain of events in human time. Actually, despite his popular reputation, Hegel didn't have a very sunny view of this process. He described the process generally cumulatively as having been ein Schlachtbank, das heißt ein Slaughterbench, so the slaughterbench of human history. So there's nothing glorious or attractive about it. However, he also believed that one can ask what the meaning of this contingent succession of events might be. And that's a different order of question. Essentially, it's a philosophical question. The philosophy of history inquires into the meaning, if you like, of the slaughter bench. So what has been its purpose, one might ask? Not what will be its purpose, but what after the fact can we say has been its purpose? And for Hegel, one can see after the fact that its purpose has been the realization of freedom. This wasn't an intentional program, but an unintended outcome. Even though it's an unintended consequence of the processes of the slaughter bench, nonetheless, he does believe that the outcome is morally rational, or that's to say, in a way, the simplest way of thinking about this is to say, you wouldn't pick another world. After that process of struggle and turmoil and labor, there is no other previous moral order that you would choose. So this, the question then moves on to really, where had society gotten to for Hegel? So I'm moving into the second part of your question. How does his own view of his own time compare with our time? And first of all, I think to understand his view of his time, you need some sense of his view of the succession of events, because one has to understand that he's viewing history in really world historical terms as the progress from, east to west, from Chinese, Indian, Persian, and Egyptian societies through the Greco-Romans, also passing through world religions like Judaism and Christianity, up until feudal government, then absolutism, and then what he thought was the preferred model for his own era, which is constitutional monarchy. Now, constitutional monarchy involved the separation and coordination of legislative, judicial, and executive powers. So a parliament and a system of administration and a monarchy, but also rooted in a society based on commerce, the modern family, connected to the rise of professions, the end of a society of ranks, and the rise of what we think of as classes. So that's what he's thought of as the ideal model of his world, much of which we share. I mean, we are closer to that world than we are to the ancient Romans or the Greeks. We also have, a constitutional regime with a separation of powers, based in commercial society, and so on and so forth. We also, live under modern families in which, for instance, we choose our partners rather than them being prescribed for us. These are modern institutions for him, and we still share much of that world with him. However, that's not to say that we're in Hegel's world, because, of course, clearly we're not. We exist in a regime of mass democracy, in which gender relations have been transformed, in which the welfare state has emerged, in which we're living in the aftermath of Soviet communism and German National Socialism and so on and so forth. So we are living in a different world. So I think our job is very much to juxtapose our world with his world in the context of a larger framing of sort of world history. So that's a long answer to your question, but Hegel's a complicated figure. So that's my overview.
In that same tune of what you were saying, Professor, if I may, I would like to play a clip in which acclaimed orchestral conductor, Maestro Karim Hassan, captures this idea of Hegel of conceiving history as a cumulative process, as something that just happens. But in his case, when talking about the way the best composers write their music and what he brilliantly exemplifies with Shostakovich's music. Let's listen.
Let's take a composer who's, for example, Shostakovich. Shostakovich's music in certain points of his life obviously hugely influenced by the historical circumstances that he found himself in, obviously being the Soviet regime and the fear for his life and the war and all of this that was going on at that time. And of course, we can hear some of that violence of the war in the music that he writes. It's a key component to several moments of his symphonies that he writes. But in my opinion, the way that the composer writes his music, or certainly in this case Shostakovich writes his music, tells us not necessarily through a historical context what's going on, but we can hear that in the music itself. I guess what I'm trying to say is we don't necessarily need to know everything that is going on historically at that time. It helps hugely, it helps massively to understand all of this. But I think the very finest composers convey the story within the music itself. And I think that's a really important differentiation to make.
Well, I think with this, we should be ready to start talking about social movements. Sven, in your perspective as a sociologist, what would be your definition of social movement, and which would be for you the first identifiable social movement, let's say as an organized mobilization with the goal of implementing or preventing also a change in society's structure or values?
Yeah, I think in sociology, we classically define social movements as informal networks of people and groups with shared beliefs and also some solidarity. And of course, these kind of networks then mobilize about some conflictual issues, oftentimes through the frequent use of various forms of protest. Or to put it different, I mean, a social movement is something that we often see out there marching in the streets, not just once, but on a regular basis. And the people there share really a sense of belonging and a very clear stance against some authority. Other authors have then added that it's not just about social movements being in opposition to something, but that social movements also really are advocates of broader social change, be it in the political or cultural field. And I'm not an historian, so I'm very much looking forward to what Richard has to say. But then, of course, to properly challenge authority and being agents of social change, social movement scholars tie kind of the historical emergence of fully fledged social movements to modernization. And the historical sociologist Charles Tilly, which is also one of the kind of godfathers in social movement, said that the British abolitionist movement against slavery has, as he said, some claim to be the first social movement in history because it brought all the ingredients that I just listed above to the streets from, he says, even very precisely from 1787 to 1833. I have to say, when then looking at contemporary societies, oftentimes such definitions are not always that helpful because, of course, they put the bar super high for what is a social movement and counts as a social movement. And I also have to say, of course, it's not always that easy to say when such a thing like a social movement really takes off or when it fades away. So in that sense, we can also have movement-like formations that might not have all these ingredients of a sense of belonging, marching massively in the streets and so on, but they can still advance major transformations in how people, for example, see the world.
Professor Bourke, from a historian perspective, what would be the first movement identified as a social movement for you?
Right. Well, I agree with much of what Sven has said, and ideally, the historian's perspective and the sociologist's perspective would align. I mean, there's no necessary conflict here. Sven mentioned Charles Tilly. Well, of course, he's an historical sociologist. So, as I say, there's a certain alignment there. I would say it's probably impossible to identify the first social movement. One might say that the first social movements were not, in fact, social at all, but were religious. So we could begin with the Reformation and think of assorted popular religious movements in the early modern period. I mean, one could start there, like, for instance, Anabaptism. I mean, enormously influential in Munster, and it was some kind of disseminated, mass project, if you like. So it certainly involved, to use Sven's definitions, informal networks based on belief and solidarity. But of course, it's not social. It's religious. But one could equally think of various religious parties in the English Civil War associated with Puritanism. I think they're certainly very important examples. These were mostly political as much as they were religious, it should also be said. But religious views equally had social content. So all these dimensions, social, political, and religious, I think, in a way come together. Of course, Christianity itself had social content. Not that I would describe Christianity to begin with as a social movement, simply because a movement of 12 people is not really social. It's apostolic. Well, for later movements, one might think about popular mobilization, much as Tilly did during the Wilkes Affair in England. So we're now in the sort of late 18th century. The Wilkes Affair in England, or in the period of the American Revolution, or of course, most specifically, the most common beginning reference point is in fact the French Revolution. Yet it has to be said these were political movements to begin with, and then derivatively, or at least in part, social. Certainly, I would say the social question emerges with the French Revolution. And with the social question, you begin to sort of border onto the territory of specifically a social movement. So when we think of the first social movements strictu sensu, we might think of 19th century movements animated by the social question. That's to say, the question of the dynamics of riches and poverty. And here, an obvious prominent movement was that of Chartism in Britain, which, while social in character, was also political in intention, it should be said. Also, incidentally, one might mention in Ireland the mass movement for Catholic emancipation and then for the repeal of the Union. I mention that because it's one of the earliest movements that involved mass mobilization, literally politically orchestrated mobilization, and including monster rallies. The notion of social movements as a modern historical phenomenon was introduced really by the German social and legal philosopher Lorenz von Stein in his book, The History of the Social Movement from 1789 to the present, a book published in 1850. His concern was with how social groupings gained consciousness and agency. So again, with his questioning were very much into Sven's territory of, first of all, a modernization process, second of all, a sort of notion of belonging, also an element of opposition, but also of social advocacy. Well, von Stein was interested in the rise of social demands, placing demands for social improvement, particularly associated with the working class. His book is published in 1850. Of course, that's just after Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, which was also, of course, claiming to inaugurate a social movement, particularly associated with the working class. So they shared a view about politics now as being premised on social movements, and their interest was in a majority, as they described it, social interest that would be embodied in a social movement. Because interestingly, their notion that they were connected to a majority of a socially interested class, the proletariat, was of course misrepresentation, because it wasn't a majority. It was a world historical massive minority. And of course, most 20th century Marxist social movements were then, in Russia and in China, not really proletarian, or at least they had to, from a proletarian base, conquer the majority peasant population. But anyway, that's a larger question. So all of that is to say, that's a complicated question. I think it's hard to date a beginning. But one has to think, I think, if one's moving from the early modern period to the modern period, about that transition from religious movements to political movements to social movements properly.
Professor, you mentioned this multi-dimensional quality of social movements. And hearing this, I would like to complement your intervention with an excerpt where Reverend Barbara Holmes talks about the different dimensions contained in the civil rights movement, giving us the example in how spirituals or religious songs and the arts cohabit as expressions in the public square.
If you take, for example, the civil rights movement, there's public theology and the arts in one. You march silently or you march with song. You prepare for encounters with the police by meeting in the church beforehand and singing spirituals. You have to remember that the people who were in the struggle during the civil rights movement were all different religions, different belief systems. They weren't all on one accord. It was the spirituals that put them on one accord. It was the singing of Bernice Johnson Reagan. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around.
Sven was just mentioning that social movements are all but static, and yourself, you were also mentioning that. And that it is not easy to define where does a movement takes off and when does it begins to blur or fade away. And also that there are different elements to a social movement. Given that, and if we understand history as a complex cumulative process, in your opinion, what would be a typical example of how a social movement emerges and later disappears or dissolves in the course of history?
Yes. Well, again, difficult to say. It's very difficult to say when one historical phenomenon has disappeared and another emerged, precisely because of your point about the historical process being cumulative. So first of all, within any historical rupture, there are always continuities. But secondly, there's always, after the rupture, the interpretation of one's own behavior in the light of the past, despite the fact that differences have occurred. In the modern period, social movements are politico-social movements, I would say, like socialism itself. And they've spawned, as I say, traditions. I don't think they have so much risen and disappeared, really as perpetuated and transformed themselves as they themselves reinterpret their own possibilities and their meaning. So the tradition survives, though the demands might change. The same pattern might be detected in, for instance, modern feminist movements. There's a sense of continuous subject matter, it's all about women, but developing aims and strategies. It's not the same project and it's not the same means of pursuing the project. So I think if we're thinking of social movements like socialism, communism, feminism, none of them have quite disappeared, so all of them have been transformed. So for movements that have disappeared, I think one might look to religious movements. So again, I sort of touched on this in my answer to your first question. So movements like the Levelers, the Diggers, the Ranters, Fifth Monarchy men. I don't know the extent to which these sort of religious groupings will be familiar to your listeners, but they were enormously influential in 17th century England, and they drove the English Revolution forward, and they were sort of minorities within minorities of Puritan dissenting religious, social and political movements all at once. These constellations of sort of religious enthusiastic movements, I mean, in Germany, you might think more specifically about Anabaptism. They didn't really have 18th and 19th century successors, not clearly in any case. So you might say that they did disappear. In fact, you could say that such religious movements in the 19th century were replaced by social movements.
So you both mentioned the many ingredients containing a social movement, from its informal networks and the sense of belonging they create, to the absurdity of trying to identify the precise moment in history in which they appear or disappear. In the next excerpt, we will hear Reverend Barbara Holmes again talk about the significance of the drums for African people captured and enslaved, and the link of these drums to tap dance as an act of defiance and protest that surfaced later in another moment of history.
Africans were brought to the Americas as captured human beings. They were not allowed to bring their drums with them, and the drums were a major source of communication on the African continent. The drums were treated almost as if they were a human voice. They would beat the drums to help the ancestors to traverse in the evenings the waters as they were crossing from this life to the other life. They used drums for celebration. They used drums as an intrinsic part of the weaving together of community. And the captors knew this and took their drums away. And so African Americans learned how to replicate the sound and the mystery of the drum with their feet. They tap danced, they clapped in syncopated rhythms, they sang songs that reverberated and echoed one another. And so you may take the drum away from the drummer, but you can't take the drum beats out of the drummer's heart. And so if that drum is part of who you are, it will be expressed in another way. And that's what Savion Glover was doing. He was tapping out what the drum would have called for. He was showing his resistance to oppression. He was stomping out liberation just as clearly as if he had had a talking drum.
Professor Bourke, to what extent is the historical study of the interaction between the state and society, but now in form of labor unions, NGOs, churches, and other civil organizations, reliable to identify the rise of a specific social movement from, let's say, a street demonstration or an isolated act of protest? And Professor, likewise, could that study, now that it would be more defined, help us identify elements to predict if a certain movement will be disappearing as a social movement or not in the future?
Yeah, I see. Well, prediction is always hard. Prediction is always hard. I think your question, in a way, is asking to what extent social movements are rooted in institutions, like, as you say, unions and churches and so forth. I do think it's impossible to orchestrate a social movement without organization. I mean, Sven said at the beginning that social movements are informal networks. I mean, of course, I agree with that to the extent that they're not the state, but they also do involve organization. So yes, institutions and structures are key, I would say. That doesn't mean that the emergence of such a structure would be a predictor for the advent of a social movement or its disappearance. I just think the business of prediction is difficult. I mean, I suppose I would tend to agree that a social movement is more likely to disappear if it's not entrenched. It's more likely to become entrenched if it's got an institutional foundation. I think it's also more likely to survive if it's got a script. I mean, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant once mentioned that no religion with a sacred text had ever disappeared. Judaism hadn't disappeared, Islam hadn't disappeared, Christianity hadn't disappeared, whereas many other religions had. And the reason for the non-disappearance is precisely the survival of the sacred text. Now, the sacred text in a way is an institution. It's something that societies can return to again and again for interpretation. So that ensures the perpetuation of the movement. So I suppose I'm saying that institutional entrenchment, and with even sacred text being an example of that, is much more likely to ensure the perpetuation of a social movement.
Sven, following that train of ideas, and socially, what role do civil societies and NGOs have played in the past? You were mentioning something already. And what role do they play now for all in the stability or instability of established democracies?
Well, I think, to put it quite bluntly, I think modern democracy is unthinkable without a lively civil society. If we really understand that as a sphere where citizens act voluntarily and collectively for the common good, and also a sphere that is, of course, as Richard said, closely connected to the state and to market dynamics, but still something separate, so to say. But at the same time, I would say we often see in public debates a bit an easy trap that people fall into. And that simple kind of view of civil society and democracy is often the more the better. So the more of it we have, the better for democracy. But I think that, of course, the historical study of social movements has shown, but also when we look at contemporary societies, is just a far too undercomplex kind of a view of this relationship, because civil society in itself is, of course, a much more ambivalent phenomenon, and oftentimes also the site where struggles for democracy and democratization actually takes place. And I mean, just to mention some examples, Sherry Berman's great work on civil society and the collapse of the Weimar Republic shows how strongly kind of civil society developments, also in the countryside of Germany, actually kind of led to the downfall of democracy and the embedding of fascism in society. But nowadays, I mean, we can also look at countries that are on a path of democratic backsliding. Here in Europe, if you look at Hungary, Poland, but also Brazil, I mean, there is a lot to see when you look at civil society, and it's not just civil society resisting these processes of backsliding, but oftentimes civil society is the site which also stabilizes these processes with anti-democratic tendencies.
Sven, you were highlighting the importance and yet ambivalent role of civil society in the success of achieving democracy. And you mentioned the easiness in which a backsliding can happen even in well-established democracies. To describe the struggle for democracy, I would love to play a clip, but this time as a way of a metaphor, using the search for symmetry in a garden. And who could be better for this than Louis Benesch, one of the greatest landscapers of our times, exemplifying the quest for symmetry with that of the balance looked for in a Japanese garden. Monsieur Benesch reminds us that freedom is a vision and the essential role that knowledge plays in its maintenance.
The freedom sometimes is a vision. And like in Japanese garden, they look free, but they are totally maintained. And you see 10 wonderful chaps climbing into a pine tree just to pull 4 needles that way to oblige a branch to grow a bit lower. And but in a vision which will look like nature, but which is totally the result of the human mind. So we are living in a very funny place and in a very funny time, because there is some act that you can't do anymore because of less people knowledgeable about gardens or about maintenance. And of course we go to more freedom in many ways, naturally.
maybe coming back to the French Revolution. Of course, we all know kind of the principles that are related to that revolution that are about advancing individual and civil rights and the famous dictum of liberté, égalité and fraternité. And I would like to come back what I kind of, quoting Charles Tilly, said was kind of the first modern social movement, the abolitionist movement. And I was just wondering, what kind of connections do you actually see between the emergence of the abolitionist movement and the French Revolution's principles? In what other ways maybe did also this French Revolution impact the abolitionist movement at that time?
Yes, well, of course, the abolitionist movement is a fascinating social event altogether, but it does predate the French Revolution. It was actually originally mostly inspired by religious sentiment, for instance, in England, by Methodism, by other sort of political sentiments in France and elsewhere too. But the French Revolution certainly gave the abolitionist movement new momentum. I mean, slavery was opposed by Montesquieu. It was opposed by Edmund Burke, opposed, of course, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who died in 1778. So again, before the French Revolution. So it's not. So the French Revolution is not causal in relation to the rise of a new abolitionist consciousness, but it definitely gave it steroids, if you like. I mean, that's to say, it definitely gave it, it supercharged it by associating abolitionism with a wider egalitarian socio-political movement. Apart from anything else, France was itself an empire. So the principles of the French Revolution were going to be examined across the empire. And as we know, whilst there was a revolution in France, there was also soon after a revolution in Haiti also. So I would say the French Revolution added dynamism to the abolitionist movement, but the abolitionist movement predates it. Also, one would have to differentiate here abolitionist sentiment from abolitionist movement. I mean, those who campaigned for abolition was one thing, which you know was a specific, mostly religious social movement, but others sort of, if you like, hommes de lettres, men of letters. I should say men and women of letters who opposed slavery and wished to abolish both slavery and the slave trade. This was an extensive set of people in France and Britain and Germany, just to mention the places that I know about. So it's a complicated picture, but the French Revolution was consequential, but not decisive, I would say.
Thank you. It's a very good picture, the French Revolution as a supercharger. I mean, you've also extensively worked on and given a lecture on Hegel and the French Revolution, and you consider Hegel as really being different from other political theorists, such as Hannah Arendt or Leo Strauss, in the sense that he proposes to distinguish what is still current and what has expired, what you also already alluded to before. I just wanted to come back what you before also called a bit this kind of infection of nationalism. So would you say that the nationalist ideals that emerged, of course, with the French Revolution and then later on with the revolutions of in 1848, 49, are in some way being revived in today's populist nationalism? And why do you think we experience the revival of such archaic models of thought these days?
Yes, well, this is, of course, a very complicated question. And I think there are various dimensions to nationalism itself, which one would perhaps want to disaggregate. I would say it's not immediately obvious what populism is. You're right to locate its origins, the origins of the issue, at least, in the French Revolution, because it raises the question of, who are the people and what is popular power? So in some sense, that's at least a turning point. That gave prominence to the idea, at least, of popular government. But the French Revolution, whilst being in some sense, or to some extent, committed to the notion that, in the end, governments are accountable to the population and therefore government should be popular. It was also based on a commitment to constitutionalism. And these two principles, in a way, popularity and constitutionalism, contradict one another, in certain respects at least. The idea, that is, of the people ruling cuts across the idea of constraining power. The two principles have jostled, I think, ever since the French Revolution. In modern democracies, popular power vies with or competes with the need to limit power. So the way this is normally described or put is to say that democracy and liberalism compete. Contemporary populism is a recent version, I would say, of that struggle, where commentators dislike the combination. They call it populism. If they like it, they call it the voice of the people. So I think it's a heavily politicized term. If you're an anti-Trumpian, you'll describe it as populism. But of course, the American Constitution under Trump didn't quite collapse. There were checks and balances which actually operated in the end, as we know. So there's the element of the voice of the people, and there's the element of constraining power, which in practice must mean constraining the voice of the people. And in the midst of all this is the question of, well, who rightly represents the voice of the people? And that's always a fraught question. And I think, really driving to the heart of your question, and the issue of populism is a struggle over, what the true voice of the people is, built into which is a sort of conflict about elites versus the real people, if you like. I mean, this is a live issue, obviously, in Germany today as well. And I think that's connected to really differently stratified populations and their political affiliations, the stratification being connected to education processes, university attendance, the fact that German, American and British populations are divided, 45-55 or 40-60 into those who go to university and those who don't. Those who do don't like populism. These are crude demographics, but those who do don't like populism and are described as elites by those who abhor populism and are educated within universities. That's too broad brushstroke and too crude. You get the picture. There's a sort of complicated social dynamic which is specific to our time, related to this longer term, I think, conflict between popularity on the one hand and constitutionalism on the other. That's the sort of political vehicles for this struggle.
Conservatives tend to favor institutions and practices that guarantee stability and promote a gradual evolution, versus liberalists or progressives who further social and political reform in a more rapid tempo. And when I thought about this, I thought about exemplifying it by a famous feud between Goethe's theory of color versus Newton's prisma, a feud of poetry against physics, both being different perspective and both being right, of course. And Newton breaking with the past and making the intangible tangible, and Goethe assuming the responsibility as guardian of the divine. And knowing that through history, the abusive and manipulative use of arguments when competing for dominance in the political arena, both right and left can become radical, and both extremes could get pretty ugly. Why, knowing all of these, is the political situation so polarized around the world? Haven't we learned our lesson about populism, whether left or right?
Yes, so that's a question very much about polarization and whether, given that we've had earlier polarizations in European and indeed in world history, why do we seem to be repeating ourselves? Why have lessons not been learned? Well, I would say lessons have been learned, but they are often partially unlearned. Populism was not has not meant a turn to what is sometimes called fascism or totalitarian populism. So we've not seen a reversion to the 1930s. But I think polarization, as you say, is the reason for the appearance of some kind of repetition. So polarized parties, by definition, see extremes. Each sees an extreme on the other side, and they interpret these extremities in the light of the past. So in the US, each side, left and right if you like, alleges either socialism or fascism against their rivals. Now, both these allegations seem to be inaccurate. I don't think the Democratic Party in the United States is socialist. I don't think the Republican Party is fascist. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing to complain about in populist sentiments. I mean, there clearly are dangers in pushing your antagonism against your rivals to such an extent that you're prepared to explode or undermine constitutional propriety in the name of the people, which is, of course, only a faction of the people anyway. So I fully appreciate the dangers, and I'm not sanguine about it. I don't think no lessons have been learned, but I think that the lessons are confused in the heat of polarization, if you like. So I think polarization is very much the problem, as you say, but I think it takes two sides to polarize. And both sides currently in Europe and the United States are sort of self-righteously digging in on their own side of the polarity whilst demonizing their antagonists. And I do think that whilst all of us are going to think our antagonists are wrong, it's our first duty, at least as social scientists or academics, to understand them rather than to join the hysterical tweeting masses in adding to the polarity.
Hi, we would love to hear your comments and learn about what you see. Share your input at www.ccpodcast.com and follow us on social media. Oh, I almost forgot. To accompany us in this season's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And now let's continue with Ceci.
There is a great novel by the name My Name is Red, written by Nobel Prize Orhan Pamuk, a thrilling murder mystery about the Ottoman Empire that is most generous as describing the difference aroused by the clash of cultures between a splendorous but at the same time violent and fundamentalist Istanbul and the Renaissance Venice, with all the Venetians' known Muslim practices, such as drinking wine, hearing music, and even their love for dogs. The center of this thriller spins around the Sultan's secret book. What was secret about the Venetian artist's work was the idea of the self, reflected in portraits. As an illustrator for the Sultan, Black, the main character, visits a Venetian master in a secret commission. And this is how he describes with astonishment how the Venetian masters depicted people in portraits.
What was the narrative that this representation was meant to embellish and complete? As I regarded the work, I slowly sensed that the underlying tale was the picture itself. The painting wasn't the extension of a story at all. It was something in its own right. I never forgot the painting that bewildered me so. I left the palazzo, returned to the house where I was staying as a guest, and pondered the picture the entire night. I, too, wanted to be portrayed in this manner. But no, that wasn't appropriate. It was our Sultan who ought to be thus portrayed. Our Sultan ought to be rendered along with everything he owned, with the things that represented and constituted his realm. I settled on the notion that a manuscript could be illustrated according to this idea. The Venetian virtuoso had made the nobleman's picture in such a way that you would immediately know which particular nobleman it was. If you'd never seen that man, if they told you to pick him out of a crowd of 1,000 others, you'd be able to select the correct man with the help of that portrait. The Venetian masters had discovered painting techniques with which they could distinguish any one man from another without relying on his outfit or medals, just by the distinctive shape of his face. This was the essence of portraiture. If your face were depicted in this fashion only once, no one would ever be able to forget you. And if you were far away, someone who laid eyes on your portrait would feel your presence, as if you were actually nearby. Those who have never seen you alive, even years after your death, could come face to face with you as if you were standing before them.
Now let's turn rapidly the page to somewhere between the 16th and the 18th century. As the French Revolution broke and became the major factor of European politics, as we've been hearing, philosophers like Descartes, Locke, Hume, and William James, Kant, and Fichte put the self at the center of the stage. The idea of the ultimate freedom was imagination, as rational thinking, and the idea of the self. It was in that moment in history that the individual experience became the guiding light of thought, at least formally. Professor Bourke, could you give us some orientation regarding this moment of history and what was so revolutionizing about Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason regarding the making of identity and self-consciousness?
Yes, I can. That is... Well, I'm very pleased you've asked that question because I would describe it as a very Hegelian question. And we started with Hegel, so it's good to be back with him. I mean, Hegel saw the modern world as having been or having involved an interconnected process of transformation that involved discrete but related elements: society, politics, religion, art, and thought. All of them had sort of been transformed in accordance with the principle of, to use your phrase, individualism, or, if you like, in accordance with a transformation of the idea of the self. Society became more liberal, politics became more representative, religion became more accountable. He had the Reformation in mind, obviously. Art became suffused with different representations of the self. You can think of Shakespeare's Hamlet, for instance, very much about the agonizing self-reflective self. And of course, the final element, you might say, is thought itself, or philosophy. And Hegel thought that the passage from Descartes to Kant, as you yourself mentioned, was very much about developing preoccupations with the self. So you specifically ask about Kant, and what was revolutionary about his idea was very much the idea that normativity or law-giving, or values, you might say, or values and standards, both in nature and in society, they derived, he thought, from the self, not from outside, not from God, not from nature, but from the self. So first from that. Second of all, that the self both generated and imposed on itself its own values or norms. And third of all, that these included moral norms. I mean, I'd say that's the Kantian revolution, basically, in a nutshell. Now, Kant's successors or post-Kantians all described this as a revolution in how we conceived of the world in terms of a transformation of how we saw the role of the self. So post-Kantianism was an exploration of this image of the self as self-governing or self-grounding, and therefore free and law-giving. So that's a slightly abstract way of formulating it, but I think you get the point. I mean, Kant's self was a self-grounding or free self, and this was seen as a sort of transformation in how humans were viewed and how their values, the origins of the values were viewed. That was the Kantian revolution.
Again, jumping fast forward into the 20th century, observers also described the new social movements in the wake of 68 as social movements aiming to put individual self-expression and liberation first, pushing the boundaries of what is considered legitimate behavior in our societies. Key examples are, of course, the fight of the women's movement for gender equality, as you already mentioned it, or also the fight of LGBTQ groups against discrimination and for the equality of different sexual orientations. Now, when looking at the evolution of the exploration of personal identity and individual agency from a historian's perspective, how would you say, what would be the main difference on understanding the self during the 18th and 19th century and understanding the self in today's political struggles and movements?
Yes. Well, very tricky. I mean, I think our sense of self and identity is a product of the late 18th and early 19th century. The idea of, as it were, conscientious self-assertion against custom and against establishments really derives from then. That's, of course, not to say that there have been no changes. I mean, I think the advent of Freud changed how we think about subjectivity. And as you yourself say, so very much did the culture of self-expression in the 1960s, the self as entitled to complete self-expression, as it were. But I would say that the roots of these notions are nonetheless do lie within German idealism. So I think there is a beginning point and then sort of changed attitudes, as you say, certainly around gender and sexuality in the 1960s. You might even say race, gender and sexuality in the 1960s. But as I said, the very idea of the self as entitled to self-expression, I think that's an idea, a German idea from the early 19th century.
But I mean, you said now kind of the idea was there, but somehow it transformed in the 60s or kind of following 68. How would you explain that shift as a historian?
Yes, well, I think various things came together. I think the 1950s were experienced as constrictive and oppressive, not least for gender relations, and that was no longer viable because of the different roles that women performed in 2 world wars. So it was no longer sustainable. The idea of a rigid differentiation of roles for the sexes, as they were called. I think, in a way, that's the biggest social transformation of the modern period altogether, is the revolution in sexual relations, including relations between the sexes. And I think that's both a change which needs to be traced to social developments, as I say, the impact of the wars, and contraception, but also a change in, understanding, such that it just no longer seemed plausible that there were rigidly differentiated roles between men and women. And I think that insight has had an enormous impact upon post-1960s society, including the current moment. So I think that's an example of the differences which took place. But I think, to make my previous point, I mean, the groundwork for this was laid in the early 19th century. For instance, attitudes to marriage, to open marriage, to multiple sexual partners. That was canvassed in Jena by the German Romantics. So there is a precedent, but obviously it became much more pervasive in the 1960s and much more widely transformative. It wasn't, of course, only gender. It was also, in the American case, relations between, what were then described as blacks and whites, or was today described as African Americans and whites. So, this is a ramifying and complicated picture. It's still going on. It comes in waves. So I accept your point about difference and the extent to which self-expression has become an all-pervasive norm, impacting upon social relations altogether. I think that's true. The 60s is the tipping point.
Besides the rise of specific movements, there has also been a noticeable increase in what some observers in this context refer to as culture war and polarization around identity politics. And I mean, you already named one of the key moments of this, the election of Trump in the US, but also Brexit is often singled out as a key instance of these new identity-related struggles. But yet, as we all know, and you also already said, these struggles are, of course, intertwined with other social struggles concerning race, gender, or social inequality. I would like to once more kind of ask you, what are for you the closest historical parallels to the type of polarization that we witness today?
Yes, thanks. Well, I think this is very much the aftermath of the 1960s, as implied in my answer to your last question. I think polarization around social attitudes and values touching on religion, and we mentioned race and gender, but we forget that in the United States, certainly, religion's also absolutely key, and it's marked a dividing line around social attitudes. In any case, these values touching on religion, race and gender, I think the polarization has been rampant really since the 1960s. There have been different emphases at different times. So socialist agitation around economic distribution gained a certain ascendancy probably between 1970 and the late 1980s, and then probably followed a period of relative pacification. In a way, maybe the Clinton and Blair eras. Since 2008, probably the forces of opposition have reappeared. So the financial crisis, the war in Iraq, I think these had transformative impact. Again, now, like the 1960s, universities have been prominent on the side, on one side of the debate. And this is focused, again, most recently on race and gender. The phrase culture war makes it sound new. I'm not sure it is that new if one's, at least at least extends back to the 60s. It does have new dimensions, of course. But broadly speaking, I think what we're talking about today is post-60s US politics shorn of socialist economics. And I think what we're looking at is the ever more successful exportation of American politics into a European context. So European student radicals ape and mimic their American trendsetters. So the American idiom has been successfully exported since the decline of Marxism, really. And that's how the current terrain looks to me. So culture war, most political struggles are culture wars anyway, but I know what you mean. And I think there is something specifically characteristic about the post-60s period, not least the extent to which, youth is glorified and self-glorifying and politically active and gives animus to a sort of, if you like, adolescent style of politics. In other words, about the pure possibilities of self-expression, to come back to that phrase, without regard to the fact that, well, half the population is opposed to you and you need consensus to make progress. So I think the culture war has been exasperated on both sides. I think it's got deep roots, and I think it's very characteristic of America, and we're experiencing it in Europe because of the power of American cultural imperialism. That's how I see it.
Yeah, very interesting. I think also in political sociology, we've kind of imported a term from the US literature, and that is effective polarization, to exactly kind of say it's beyond ideological and interest-based differences. It's really about effect. So we very strongly have positive feelings about who we perceive as the in-group, and we very much dislike who we perceive as the out-group. And of course, in many cases, and you already said that before, this kind of effective polarization then makes kind of finding compromise much harder and makes it very difficult for people to actually see us in them, as some colleagues put it. And ultimately, of course, these conflicts may also evoke such strong emotions for individuals involved in these two sides that they would also legitimize violence against their political opponents. And of course, there we also see that in the US when we look at survey material and so on. Again, because I love to talk with a historian, I was just wondering if you had some examples in history where you also see such kind of effective, kind of group-based polarization and tensions, which was released through other means than violence and turned out to be effective. If you could maybe mention some of these tools.
Well, I'll just mention a couple very quickly, since I suppose that the obvious cases is the Indian independence movement. And the other is, I suppose, most conspicuously, the US civil rights movement, certainly under Martin Luther King. I think they were sustained by, ideology, but definitely also effective attachments. They're the most successful models, I think, for subsequent nonviolent social protest movements. But broadly speaking, I think nonviolent social protest is more standard and normative than violent social protest movements. So in many ways, given that it's movements against the state, it's hard for violence to succeed. So violence has been a minority enterprise, really, I would say. But the great examples of successful, self-consciously non-violent and anti-violent social movements were surely Gandhianism and Martin Luther Kingism.
Talking about non-violent methods, throughout this season, which we dedicated to the theme movement, all and each of our guests convene in the importance of building up an inclusive society and in the ability of different kinds of movements to shape it into a more constructive, positive, and healthier one. In this sense, we will hear Andrew Ceci, president of the Migration Policy Center in Washington, D.C., talk about enabling more flexible and resilient strategies to attend changing circumstances present in migration. Jose Hernandez, former NASA astronaut, talk about the furthering of STEM education for the new generations. Rabbi Rami Shapiro, professor in religious studies, talk about avoiding tribalism when practicing religion. And both Yoon Shields, assistant conductor of the Halle Orchestra, and Peter Lovett, cognitive psychologists, talk about the transformative power in society by music and by dance.
We talk about having resilient systems. You want to have an immigration system that's resilient because things are going to change. I mean, you can build something for the current moment, but your labor force needs are going to change. The state of the economy, the business cycle, there'll be need for more workers or fewer workers. The political debates are clearly going to change. And on the other side, mobility from other countries will change because of everything from climate to war to economic conditions. So you just really have to have something that's flexible in place and be willing to adjust over time. And one of the things that I think has happened in the modern world, it feels like migration is everywhere now. But if you actually look at the numbers, people are migrating more or less at the same rate they used to. What has changed is it's become more unpredictable. People can move much quicker. The routes that people use, the patterns change much quicker because of modern technology and because of social media. Right? I mean, you saw this in Europe in 2015, 2016, when originally it was, Syrians coming into Europe and then other groups joined in as well. You've seen this in the Western Hemisphere in the Darien Gap right now in Panama, where people have found, a place that we assumed no one could migrate through because it was so dangerous. And now we have thousands of people a month coming through it. People have many more options when they're trying to figure out where to go. And that makes policy, much more confusing and a lot more need to be flexible and to be resilient as circumstances change.
We reach out to kids in the 5th grade. No accident there because 5th graders are 10 years old. And we expose them to careers in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math. And since I decided I want to be an astronaut when I was 10 years old, I figured that's when we should start reaching out to the kids.
When religions fall to the sin of tribalism is when they see themselves as exclusively true and everyone else is false. And every religion has that, is in danger of doing that. I think you can rescue the religion from tribalism by recognizing that they are fingers pointing toward the moon.
Orchestras are starting to realize that we need to play music that people in the community can relate to. So diversity, equity, and inclusion are increasingly becoming a norm when we're planning concerts, and doors are gradually starting to open for female musicians, musicians from ethnic minorities.
I've been enormously lucky to be given a platform to speak about the power of dance. But I tend not to only speak about the power of dance. I invite people to experience the power of dance. And I think my happiest moment is being on stage with an audience of, say, 10,000 people and seeing these 10,000 people who are not dancers in the traditional sense, and every single person dancing is just a joy to see and to be able to demonstrate that. So I think part of what I do in my lectures and in my talks is to share the experience of dancing, to show people, to let them feel the power of dance and movement. And I love that. I just love it. It's a wonderful thing. It's like riding a wave, being a surfer on a great wave when it comes through. And I'm very fortunate that I can look out and see all these thousands of faces alive. And dancing is an expression of life, isn't it?
According to American anthropologist David Aberle, when analyzing a social movement, one shall observe what the ideology of the movement is as a whole, as well as the specific ideology of the individuals involved in the movement, meaning their behaviors in relationship to the movement, whether this is reflected into actions, slogans, the wording used by activists, and so on. And finally, the analysis must also consider the context of the historical period. In this sense, Sven, for you as a sociologist, what kind of movement is the present climate movement? Is it a reformative movement, longing to be a transformative movement? Or could you say that for some it might even be redemptive?
Well, great that you bring up David Abel's distinction of different movements. And maybe to explain, I mean, he tries to categorize movements according to two features. That is, first, the extent, and second, the level of social change advocated by the social movement and the activists. So regarding the extent, he distinguishes partial and total change, and regarding the level, individual and societal change. And with respect to your question, I would say that given the enormous challenges humanity faces due to global warming, the climate movement ultimately must be a movement striving for total societal change, thus it would be a transformative movement in the sense as Abel kind of spelled it out. Now, when we look at its current form, it is actually very much a reformative movement because it clearly advocates change that goes beyond our individual behavior. But at the same time, when we look at the political agenda of the climate movement these days, it is very much focused on pushing governments to implement already agreed upon aims. So to give you an example, I mean, currently here in Germany, but beyond, we have heated debates around groups like Extinction Rebellion or Letzte Generation and their use of civil disobedience as a form of resistance, breaking the law justified as they claim, by the urgency of the situation. Yet when we then look at their kind of claims and slogans and what they want, they're actually quite modest. I mean, in the German debate right now, they're pushing very much for cheaper public transportation or a slightly more ambitious goals in energy supply transformation. So that, for me, kind of does not yet really kind of speak that we already see this transformative movement. Probably we will see that as the crisis kind of already takes shape much more also in the Western Hemisphere.
We will hear another set of clips of our guests talking about becoming conscious of the importance of global warming and the environment. We will hear first Tenzing Choigal Sherpa, glaciologist, talking about global warming in Kathmandu and in the Himalayas. American and Mexican poet Jennifer Clement, also President Emerita of PEN International, regarding climate change and freedom of expression. And Rabbi Rami Shapiro in the US from a religious perspective.
I'll just talk more about the Everest region and like the Hindu-Kush Himalayan regions. So what happens to all of the melt that comes down? So there will be a lot of increase in the discharge. So there are two phases that will happen. One is too much water. The other is too little water. And the worst thing is we'll have too much water when we don't need it, and we'll have too little water when we actually need it. And what happens when we have too much water? Of course, there'll be flooding. But at the same time, in case of these higher mountain regions, what has been happening and has happened as well is all of this water will start to accumulate in the form of glacial lakes. And these glacial lakes will start to outburst. And they have caused a lot of devastating damages in the Everest region and in many parts of the Hindu-Kush Himalayan region.
For example, right now in PEN, we're very aware that journalists covering the environment are being killed all over the world. And we know this is going to get worse as laws to protect the environment get stronger. So, you know, if you don't know that a river is being polluted, how can you save that river? So the protection of the freedom of expression is also the protection of the truth.
I need oxygen to survive, but my body doesn't produce oxygen. Trees and green things produce oxygen. They are as essential to my existence as my heart, right? I need the oxygen they produce. They need the gases that I exhale when I inhale their oxygen. It's completely symbiotic. And that unity, if we understood it, and I don't mean intellectually, but if we really understood it, if we really felt it, would make it impossible for us to destroy the planet. We would know that by burning down the Amazon rainforest, we are trying to asphyxiate ourselves. It's suicide. Einstein called it a delusion of consciousness. And the only solution is the mystic stripping away of the delusion to realize the true consciousness of the interconnectedness of everything, not just humans, but the entirety of the biosphere of the planet.
Through history, Sven, we have seen shifts on the environmentalists' movement. In the Industrial Revolution, the activism was led by the working class. We have seen activism driven by poor, often black communities exposed to polluted environments, and also indigenous peoples and landless peasants have played a very important role in the course of history of the different green movements. Today, the economical expectations drawn by the climate movement leave very little room for people that are less off and live in surviving modus or are insecure about their work and their future. My next question is for you, Sven. But before I make this question, I would like to play a clip where we will hear Iwan Shields, cellist and orchestral conductor, brilliantly using an allegory of the sounds produced by a well-attuned orchestra to describe the way a social movement is initiated and later supported by the whole spectrum of society, in this case, by the whole orchestra. Let's listen.
When I'm in front of an orchestra, I need to include every musician on stage to my sphere of influence, and I especially throw my energy and attention at the players furthest away in the back of the orchestra. When you're in the front, you have a wave of sound coming from behind because all the instruments are pointed towards the audience. But actually playing in the back of the orchestra is one of the most challenging things because you need to initiate that momentum, that energy that comes from the back without necessarily receiving the sound of the totality. So one of the hallmarks of a great orchestra is players in the back who are able to really lead. And you can even maybe draw a parallel to society where some of the most profound social progress comes from not from the top down, but from the grassroots level, when people really individually initiate movement and change.
And now my question to you, Sven. Is the environmental movement a white middle-class movement? Does it ignore the working class?
Well, I think there are different ways to answer this question because, first of all, I would not share this take on the current climate and environmental movement as not considering social and economic issues. Because on the one hand, the movement, as most social movements, is a very complex entity with different groups and networks, some of them more visible to the public and others less visible. And on the other hand, I think also, here in Germany and beyond, throughout even the pandemic, we have seen ever more attempts of activists to really kind of link to broader global but also local social struggles. So I really think this kind of framing of the issue as really also touching upon the poorest worldwide, but also in our societies, and that the climate movement has to do something about that, that is there. But of course, you're kind of right when we look at who is actually involved in climate demonstrations and in other kind of surveys. We can clearly see that the social base of the climate movement in advanced democracy largely stems from the so-called new middle class. So it's students, but also professionals employed in so-called social-cultural professions. And this, of course, in the kind of public fight for attention kind of creates a certain dilemma for the activists because they, of course, share more in common than just kind of their stance on the climate issue. And we see that also when they're kind of attacked by others. Of course, they're often also attacked for what is more. They're, for example, cultural beliefs. We just talked about this cultural war. So it's very hard to distance yourself from who you are in these kind of moments when these conflicts are really about the groups that are kind of opposed to each other and not just the issue. So you're right, it is, but I think they want more, but that's very hard for them to convey, I would say.
Well, we're getting into the end of our show, and I'd like to round up a little bit. Professor Bourke, we talked about in the beginning about democracy and that it is not only a disputed concept, but also a very ambiguous one, and where through history there has always been room for adherence of political philosophies of broad spectrum. And we also talk about liberalism and how there's like a crossover of right and left. And I also have the feeling that the climate movement gives a lot of room for adherence to political currents, left and right alike. And not only that, also in practical means, in the one hand, you have a tendency leaning for the fight against inequality, as you were mentioning, Sven. But sadly, technology and medical advances and good education and clean water are accessible only to a certain sector of the global population, and not strange enough, even within the same country. Professor Bourke, in your view, as a historian, do you also see this ambiguity and how in the name of this movement, different political currents are able to push their agendas in? And what would be the final consequence of this ambiguity? A feud of extremes, the erosion of the climate movement that will give way to another movement? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm generally speaking a skeptic about hard and fast categories like left and right. So I think it's only to be expected that the climate movement will have features of both. I think that's unfortunate that, climate questions have become taken up into the polarities of already established political disputes. And I think we should all make climate not a party political question, but obviously a humanitarian or human, if you like, question would be my view.
My last question goes to both of you. In your view as a historian, Professor Bourke, and as a sociologist, Sven, do you think that for the climate movement to become more effective and to enable it to achieve its goal, that it would be essential to integrate, as you mentioned, Professor Bourke, the humanitarian part, but also subjects such as technology advances and migration and global inequality in the form of poverty and the lack of education? Do you want to go first, Sven, and then we will leave Professor Bourke close this episode?
Yes, sure. I already said that, of course, the climate movement, as many movements, faces this dilemma of striking a balance between kind of radicality and really being true to themselves, who they are, and at the same time forming these broad alliances. And of course, there it is helpful to kind of connect the climate issue to other existential threats and kind of crises in our societies and worldwide. But I would also like to end here maybe by saying we've talked now a lot about social movements, but of course in mass democracy, the job of actually integrating different parts of society and forming encompassing programs is the job of political parties. So we should also not put all the kind of burden on a social movement that has to push for change, but we have to think about the political elites in charge of representing our societies.
Yes, I agree with those final words. I think the climate change movement will only succeed in the end to the extent that it is integrated with our wider politics, and won't succeed as exclusively a sort of social protest movement. I fully accept the intensity of their convictions, which are entirely honourable, and their insights are correct, but nonetheless, change is dependent on the mechanisms of change, and we don't want to destroy our politics in order to achieve that change, but to use the political levers that we have available to us, which includes, as Sven was saying, organised political parties.
To close this season, we will hear a sort of audio collage of the voices of all of our guests talking about movement by means of activism, contribution, and consciousness. These are the voices of Barbara Holmes, Jennifer Clement, Marina Viotti, Andrew Seeley, Tenzing Choigal Sherpa, Peter Baikotzi, Louis Benesch, Ewan Shields, Elisa Carrillo Cabrera, Kerem Hassan, Jose Hernandez, Rabbi Rami Shapiro, and Peter Lovett.
As a young girl coming home from college, I went to the second march in Selma. And as you remember, the first march, they beat the protesters. And Martin Luther King called for a march in Selma following that march for everyone to come. And my dad and I got on a bus from New Haven, Connecticut, and rode down to Selma, Alabama. And I remember that the troopers who were there hated us more than the people who were on the sides, screaming and cursing. But there was Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and Harry Belafonte. And so even though we were surrounded by angry mobs the night before the march, the songs, the music stood in defiance and as a public statement. What better public theology is there that we will not be turned around?
It's vocational work. So it means that you have to have a great belief in freedom of expression and be willing to fight for it. And it's every day, it's very humbling because every day I'm in contact with people who risk everything to tell the truth. And the thing is this, if we don't know the truth, how can we act? How do we know what we need to do?
You always have your inner voice that will tell you if it is the right choice or not, if it is a risk worth taking, why. Sing with your own voice. Be the artist you want to be. There is not only the boxes we know, there are many to be created yet. And more in this century, we have to go further.
We need to figure out a way that legal mobility around the world does not become something that is only for the already well-off.
We have eyes, but we can't see because we need education. We don't have literacy, we don't know how to read and write. So build us a school here, build us something here so that not only us, our future generations can then try to make something of themselves.
With all these developments that are ahead of us, so just by naming all these different developments that we will experience in the next 5 to 10 years, in my eyes, if I close my eyes, I'm dreaming of a building that is a brain tower, brings all these people together, and we are not discussing anymore, are you a neurosurgeon, are you a neurologist, are you an interventionalist, are you a scientist? No, in the end, we are a big family. Highly qualified members of this family are working for these patients and are moving the field ahead.
The movement of human beings is very important. I don't conceive any garden without thinking of the motion we have in it. I'm sure that it brings peace in a rather vibrant world.
The reason I became a musician in the first place was playing an orchestra for the first time and having a really transformative experience. I remember vividly every note of the Brahms 4th Symphony and feeling like I was looking to the side and I felt connected to the cellist that was next to me, and I felt that the whole cello section was one unit, and I could see across the violin section and the conductor, and the fact that we come from very diverse backgrounds and we play different instruments. For example, the rich, deep, and dark sonority of the contrabassoon is completely contrasting from the brilliance and the clarity of a trumpet. But we all have to come together and put our sounds on top of each other and create something in harmony, which none of us can on our own, was something that was so exciting and profoundly moving. That really set my life to a different direction, where I thought, this is something I want to dedicate my life to.
I have learned through many years, the most important for an artist is to get rich. I mean, rich in the way of knowledge. traveling through different countries, seeing different ways of working with different choreographers, different traditions, different point of view, different ways of enjoying life, of seeing dance, of techniques. There is different techniques in ballet world. So all this experience has given me a lot of a good base, and this let me grow up as a dancer, but also as a woman.
There is something about conducting, you see and you hear that we all have the same idea about how it should go. And then you see in the performance the way that the swathe of strings might physically move towards a certain harmony. And these are the moments that I think to myself, this is what music making is all about. It is that collective understanding, that collective idea about musical performance.
And the hatch, there's a window where we're looking down on Earth. And we had just made one revolution when it was my turn to unbuckle. And I could see Canada, United States, and Mexico. And I'll tell you what struck me as beautiful was that I couldn't tell where one country ended and the other began. And I said, my gosh, I had to go out of this world to realize that down there we're just one. We're one race, we're the human race.
I would like to see in every mosque and church and synagogue and temple and ashram and every cultural center and spiritual center on the planet, I would like to see a planetarium. If you go into a cathedral, we've got this big dome. That dome should be a planetarium. So you could go in and sit in the pew, but you could also look up and see the universe and realize you're part of that.
Movement is a fundamental part of who we are. Movement defines us as being alive, and movement defines our ability to demonstrate that life and to communicate that life both to ourselves and to other people. It is a fundamentally important part of our human nature, and we should stop anyone from ever restricting us from moving ever again.
Thank you very much, Professor Bourke, for giving us the honor of your time and sharing your deep knowledge in history of political thought and having us provided with a fantastic and insightful closing episode. We dearly appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, and goodbye, and thank you for the discussion.
Thank you, Sven, for making such a great co-host for this episode.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot to both of you.
If you're interested in philosophy, history, or political science, be sure to check this episode description to check Professor Bourke's work and publications. And if you want to understand the relationship between historical ideas and our present circumstances, you don't want to miss his last book, Hegel's Revolutions, published by Princeton University Press. To all our listeners, our guests, co-hosts, and of course Misha, you've made of this season a fantastic experience, and thank you. Bye-bye, and see you next season.